grain, taxes, and the ancient Egyptian ledger, bread and bureaucracy on the Nile. If you lived in ancient Egypt, your life would have been measured not just by the rhythm of the Nile, but by the rhythm of grain. Year after year, the river swelled and receded, depositing fertile silt across the floodplains. This cycle dictated the harvest. It dictated how many loaves of bread you might eat, how much beer you might drink, and how much labor you might owe to the state. But more than that, it dictated what scribes wrote on their ledgers. For behind every loaf, every jug, every basket of barley or wheat, there was a tax. You might imagine Egyptian history as pyramids, temples, and pharaohs in golden headdresses. But underneath those monuments lay a more mundane foundation: grain. Not only was it the staple food, it was also the currency of the state. Taxes were not often collected in coin, but in kind. The state demanded that farmers deliver portions of their harvest to granaries. These surpluses fed workers, supported temples, supplied armies, and maintained the ruling class. In a world where bread was life itself, the ledger of grain was the true engine of Egypt. The Nile as timekeeper. To understand this, you must begin with the Nile. Without the annual inundation, Egypt would have been little more than desert. Each summer, rains in the Ethiopian highlands sent torrents northward, swelling the river. The floodwaters rose, crept across the plains, and deposited dark soil. When they receded, the land was ready for planting. The Egyptians measured their calendar around this cycle. Ake, the season of inundation; Parait, the season of growth; and Shimu, the season of harvest. Tax officials watched the river carefully, recording the level of the flood. If the waters rose high, the harvest would be rich and taxes plentiful. If the waters were low, the harvest shrank and famine loomed. Grain production was not just an agricultural concern, but a bureaucratic calculation. The scribe's ledger. Imagine a scribe seated in the shade of a mud brick office, stylus in hand. Before him lies a roll of papyrus. On it, neat columns record names, villages, and quantities. These ledgers, written in hieratic script, were the backbone of Egypt's administration. Farmers were registered, their plots measured, and their expected yield calculated. Tax quotas were assigned accordingly. For the farmer, this meant that every basket harvested had a shadow, the portion owed to the state. Scribes kept meticulous records of how much was due and how much was delivered. A farmer who failed to meet the quota might face penalties, sometimes lashes, sometimes forced labor. In extreme cases, property could be seized. The state was not merciful when it came to grain. Yet for all their severity, the scribes were also essential. They ensured that temples received offerings, that garrisons were provisioned, that the workforce at a pyramid or canal was fed. Without them, the machinery of state would grind to a halt. Granaries, storehouses of power. Taxes collected in grain needed places to be stored. Granaries dotted the landscape, from village storehouses to great complexes near temples. These were not mere piles of sacks. They were carefully constructed silos, often mud brick towers with narrow entry points. Grain was poured in from above and removed from small openings at the base, reducing spoilage. Inside, the air was heavy with dust. Workers hauled baskets, pouring kernels into bins. Scribes stood by, tallying each delivery, reed pens scratching on papyrus. Seals of clay marked official storage jars. Every grain accounted for, every measure weighed against obligation. Granaries were symbols of authority. A full granary meant a strong state, able to feed laborers and armies. An empty one meant weakness, vulnerability, and unrest. Pharaohs sometimes boasted in inscriptions not of temples built, but of granaries filled. To fill them was to prove divine favor, to demonstrate control over the Nile's bounty. Bread and beer. But grain was not only stored, it was consumed daily, in forms both humble and sacred. Bread and beer were the staples of the Egyptian diet. Wheat and barley were ground on stone querns, kneaded into dough, baked in clay ovens, and eaten in flat rounds. Barley was fermented into beer, thick and cloudy, consumed by peasants and elites alike. Taxes in grain were often redistributed in these very forms. Workers on royal projects were not usually paid in coin, but in rations of bread and beer. A day's labor might earn several loaves and 2 jugs. For many, this was survival. Their wages came directly from the grain they had first surrendered as tax. This cycle might seem endless, even oppressive, yet it was remarkably stable. For centuries, bread and beer kept Egypt alive, their supply regulated through the ledger and the granary. The farmer's burden. For the ordinary farmer, taxes were a constant weight. Each year, scribes inspected fields, estimating potential yield. Flood levels, soil fertility, and previous harvests were all considered. Then the quota was set. Farmers harvested by hand, sickles cutting stalks in the heat. The grain was threshed, winnowed, and measured. A portion was kept, but a portion had to be delivered. The delivery itself was laborious. Baskets or sacks had to be carried, often across long distances, to granaries. At the gates, officials checked weights. Any shortfall could mean suspicion of dishonesty. Some farmers tried to hide portions, but punishments discouraged theft. And yet, there was no escape. Land was bound to obligation. To live by the Nile was to be tied to the ledger. Temples and taxes. Much of the taxed grain flowed not into secular storage, but into temples. The temple was not only a religious center, but also an economic one. Priests oversaw massive estates, staffed by laborers, supplied by grain deliveries. Offerings to the gods included bread and beer, symbolically consumed by the divine, practically consumed by the priesthood. In this way, religion and taxation were inseparable. To pay grain tax was to feed the temple, to sustain the ritual that upheld the cosmic order, Ma'at. Pharaoh's legitimacy depended not only on force, but on ensuring that offerings never failed. Grain kept the gods fed, and the gods, in turn, kept the Nile flowing. Crisis years. What happened when the flood failed? Records tell of famine years, when grain production collapsed. In such times, the ledger became a harsh mirror. Tax quotas remained high even when harvests shrank. The burden on farmers grew unbearable. Starvation spread. Famines were not just natural disasters, but political crises. Pharaohs who failed to maintain grain reserves faced unrest. In the Middle Kingdom, stories tell of starving peasants raiding granaries, of scribes unable to enforce quotas. In later times, grain shortages destabilized dynasties. The state depended utterly on the Nile, and when the river failed, no ledger could save it. Reflection. When you consider ancient Egypt, you might think first of pyramids and monuments. Yet behind those stones lay a more fragile truth: the steady recording of grain, the constant flow of taxes, the patient work of scribes. Without ledgers and granaries, there would have been no temples, no armies, no pharaohs in golden crowns. And so you wonder, if a civilization could be built upon something as ordinary as grain, what does that tell us about the foundations of power and how fragile they might be when the harvest fails? The scribe's burden and the machinery of taxation. If Section 1 showed you how bread and grain shaped the Egyptian state, Section 2 leads you into the quieter, slower rhythms of bureaucracy itself. For while farmers harvested and hauled, it was scribes who transformed grain into state power. Every measure, every field, every village was rendered into neat columns of ink. Their work may seem dull, but without it, Egypt would have been unable to feed its workers, build its monuments, or sustain its gods. The life of a scribe's day began not in the fields, but in the shade of mud brick walls, or within the courtyards of temples. He carried his reed pens, a palette with cakes of black and red ink, and sheets of papyrus or shards of limestone for drafts. Scribes were trained from boyhood, learning the difficult script of hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs that flowed quickly across papyrus. Literacy was rare, and to be a scribe was to belong to an elite profession. But their lives were not leisurely. They spent long hours hunched over documents, recording grain deliveries, calculating quotas, or drafting decrees. Their handwriting had to be precise, for a single error could alter a tax obligation or confuse a ledger. They were expected to remember not only words but numbers, converting baskets of barley into state accounts. Many scribes served not pharaohs directly, but local officials, village overseers, temple priests, or nomarchs, provincial governors. They were the link between the grand proclamations of kings and the realities of village life. The bureaucratic chain. The tax system depended on layers of authority. At the top, the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator, oversaw the kingdom's resources. Below him were regional governors, temple administrators, and military officials. Each of them relied on scribes to record inflows and outflows of grain. When harvest came, teams of scribes and officials moved through the countryside. They measured fields using ropes and rods, estimating yield. They recorded expected taxes and set delivery dates. Farmers, often illiterate, could only accept the figures handed down. Complaints were possible, but rarely successful. The system's authority lay in ink and papyrus, not in negotiation. Once collected, grain moved to central granaries. Again, scribes stood ready, tallying each delivery. Clay seals were stamped onto jars, marked with the names of officials. Deliveries were cross-checked against quotas. In temple complexes, specialized scribes tracked grain offered to the gods, rations for priests, and surpluses redistributed to workers. Punishments and enforcement. The machinery of taxation was not gentle. Surviving records, like the instructions of Angsheku or the tales of peasant complaints, reveal harsh enforcement. Farmers unable to deliver grain might be bound, beaten, or forced into labor on canals or state projects. Families could be compelled to surrender livestock or tools in lieu of missing grain. One Middle Kingdom papyrus describes tax collectors seizing donkeys from a village, leaving farmers unable to transport future harvests. Another record notes villagers driven into debt, forced to borrow grain from temples at high interest, creating cycles of dependency. For peasants, the visit of a tax team was both routine and feared. Dusty courtyards filled with officials tallying baskets, checking measures. Children stood watching, women clutching baskets of bread. Everyone knew that the numbers mattered more than their pleas. The role of corruption. No bureaucracy is immune to corruption, and Egypt's was no exception. Some scribes were notorious for skimming grain, altering figures, or favoring wealthy patrons. Farmers might bribe officials to lower quotas or to overlook shortfalls. Clay seals could be broken and replaced, allowing theft from granaries. Texts from the New Kingdom complain of corrupt tax officials fattening themselves with bread. Tales and proverbs mocked greedy scribes. Yet the system endured because it was too entrenched to fail. Even when corrupt, the ledgers still flowed upward, and granaries still filled. Temples as economic hubs. Temples were not passive recipients of grain. They became major economic engines, managing estates, renting land, and loaning grain to peasants. Their scribes maintained separate ledgers, tracking obligations to gods as carefully as taxes to the state. In effect, temples functioned as banks, with granaries as vaults. A temple granary might supply priests, feed pilgrims, or even fund military campaigns. Festivals required immense amounts of bread and beer, distributed to participants as both offerings and rations. All of this was possible only because of the scribes' records. Without ledgers, offerings would run short, festivals collapse, and the gods' presence seemed diminished. Bread as wages. Grain taxes flowed not only upward but outward, paying wages in kind. Pyramid builders, canal diggers, and soldiers received rations of bread and beer. Records from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village for tomb builders in the Valley of the Kings, show meticulous ration lists. So many loaves per day, so many jugs of beer, sometimes supplemented with vegetables or fish. When rations failed to arrive, workers went on strike, one of the earliest recorded in history. Their complaints were not about money, but about missing bread and beer. Grain, taxed and redistributed, was the lifeblood of labor. The ledger determined who ate, who worked, and who rebelled. The scribe's perspective. You might imagine the scribes as faceless bureaucrats, but they left behind voices. Instructional texts for young scribes boasted of their profession. Unlike farmers, they did not toil in the sun. Unlike soldiers, they did not risk death in battle. Be a scribe, one text urged, for he is the master of all. And yet, their daily lives were still bound by duty. They faced the pressure of accuracy, the suspicion of corruption, and the burden of dealing with disgruntled peasants. They were praised as keepers of order, but criticized as agents of oppression. They were both respected and resented. Crisis of the ledger. When Egypt faltered, the cracks appeared first in its ledgers. During the first intermediate period, after the collapse of the Old Kingdom, records become scarce. Taxes were less rigorously collected, granaries less reliably filled. Local lords asserted more independence, scribes answered to multiple masters, and peasants found themselves caught between competing obligations. In such times, the precision of the ledger gave way to improvisation. Farmers bartered grain directly, villages hoarded, and temples tried to maintain order amid scarcity. The collapse of bureaucracy mirrored the collapse of state power. Continuity across centuries, yet the system endured in remarkable continuity. From the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic era, scribes still recorded grain. Greek administrators in Egypt adopted and adapted the system, writing in Greek but using the same principles of field measurement and quotas. The Roman conquerors, too, relied on Egyptian grain to feed their empire, and so the ledgers continued. For more than 2 millennia, the basic principle held: grain was not just food, but tax, wage, and offering. The Nile gave, the farmer harvested, the scribe recorded, and the state consumed. Reflection. The machinery of Egyptian taxation may seem tedious, but it was the quiet force that built the monuments you admire today. Every stone at Karnak, every tomb in the Valley of the Kings, every obelisk in the desert was supported by loaves baked from taxed grain. The scribe's ledger, full of numbers and names, may lack the glamour of a pharaoh's inscription, but it sustained the civilization just as surely. And so you might ask, if the health of an empire can be read not in its temples, but in its ledgers, what fragile numbers sustain our own societies today? And what happens if they begin to falter? Crisis, collapse, and the fragile balance of bread. If you stood in ancient Egypt during its prosperous times, the granaries seemed eternal. Pyramids rose on the horizon, temples gleamed with offerings, and bread was abundant in the markets. The ledgers of the scribes recorded predictable cycles of planting, harvesting, and taxing. It was a system that appeared permanent, as reliable as the Nile's annual flood. Yet Egypt's history shows that this balance was fragile. When it faltered, famine, rebellion, and collapse followed. The story of Egypt's decline is written not only in stone monuments, but also in broken grain jars and abandoned ledgers. The Nile's betrayal. At the center of Egypt's vulnerability was the river itself. The Nile's flood was both generous and fickle. In high years, waters spread wide across the floodplain, leaving behind thick layers of black silt. In low years, the flood barely rose above its banks, leaving fields dry and unproductive. Farmers planted less, harvests shrank, and taxes became impossible to meet. Ancient records mention years of empty fields and silent granaries. One Middle Kingdom text, The Admonitions of a Pure, paints a bleak picture. Famine so severe that mothers could not feed their children, and corpses lay unburied. It is impossible to know how much is literary exaggeration and how much was historical fact, but the message is clear. When the Nile failed, the entire system unraveled. Scribes, faced with empty baskets, had no numbers to write. Tax quotas went unpaid. Priests found temples understocked for offerings. Pharaoh's legitimacy weakened. Hunger, more than war or invasion, gnawed at the stability of Egypt. The human cost. What did famine mean in daily life? For peasants, it meant eating less, first giving up surplus, then slaughtering animals, and finally consuming seeds meant for the next planting. Bread became coarse, mixed with whatever could be found: acacia seeds, lotus roots, or ground-up reeds. Beer, the comfort of daily life, grew watery and scarce. Debt spiraled. Peasants borrowed grain from temples, promising to repay with interest. In good years, this was manageable, but in bad years it became a trap. Families lost land, livestock, and freedom, sinking into servitude. Granaries that once seemed symbols of stability became symbols of inequality, their guarded walls holding food out of reach. For workers on state projects, famine meant strikes and unrest. Without bread and beer rations, they refused to labor. Records from Deir el-Medina show entire workforces walking away when rations were delayed. Hunger was not just a private pain, but a collective force that could paralyze the state. The politics of grain. Grain was never just food, it was politics. Pharaohs were expected to ensure abundance, a divine duty tied to Ma'at, the cosmic order. When granaries were full, pharaohs boasted in inscriptions of their generosity. I gave bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty. But when shortages struck, rulers faced blame. Foreign powers, too, understood the leverage of grain. During the late period, when Egypt was drawn into conflicts with Assyria, Persia, and later Rome, grain became tribute. Conquerors demanded shipments, treating Egypt as a breadbasket for wider empires. Under Rome, Egyptian grain fed the city of Rome itself. A failed harvest in the Nile Valley meant hunger in Italy, a reminder of how Egypt's fate stretched beyond its borders. Collapse in the ledgers. As dynasties weakened, the precision of taxation faltered. Surviving papyri show discrepancies, missing entries, and chaotic records. Temples and provincial governors sometimes withheld grain, keeping it for local use rather than delivering it to the state. Farmers resisted, fleeing obligations or hiding harvests. During the first and second intermediate periods, central authority disintegrated and the tax system fragmented. Local warlords controlled grain stores, exacting their own levies. Farmers faced multiple overlapping demands, a chaos of obligations without stability. The once orderly columns of the scribes turned into scattered, inconsistent notes, the bureaucratic mirror of political collapse. Archaeological traces of crisis. Archaeology provides glimpses of these fragile times. Granaries excavated from famine layers show signs of abandonment. Bins left half full, seal impressions broken, rodents nesting in corners. Papyri from certain years record drastically reduced quotas. Skeletal remains of peasants sometimes reveal malnutrition, stunted growth, brittle bones, and signs of starvation in childhood. At Amarna, the short-lived capital of Akhenaten, excavations show workers' villages where children suffered chronic malnourishment, even while resources were directed toward building temples to the sun god Aten. The contrast between monumental ambition and daily hunger underscores the imbalance at the heart of Egyptian society. Survival strategies. Yet Egyptians did not simply submit. Communities adapted. Families stored grain in private silos, hidden from collectors. Barter increased, with villagers trading fish, vegetables, or woven goods instead of relying solely on taxed grain. In some regions, herding grew in importance when fields failed. Religious rituals also took on new urgency. Priests performed ceremonies to implore the gods for better floods. Hymns praised Hapi, the Nile god, as bringer of grain, creator of all good things. In times of famine, these prayers reflected both desperation and resilience. Grain and inequality. Famine highlighted social divides. Elites, with access to state granaries and temple reserves, often survived with less suffering. Their tombs still show banquets, bread loaves piled high, and jars of beer offered to the dead. Ordinary farmers, meanwhile, left behind meager graves, with little more than pottery or rough baskets. This inequality bred resentment. Texts sometimes describe peasants accusing officials of corruption, of taking more than their share, of hoarding grain. One satirical tale tells of a farmer who cleverly mocked corrupt officials until justice was reluctantly granted. Such stories reflect the tension between those who labored in the fields and those who controlled the ledgers. The long arc of continuity. Despite crises, the system endured for millennia. The resilience of Egyptian grain taxation lies in its adaptability. Even under foreign rulers, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, the principle remained. Egypt's wealth was its harvest, and control of that harvest required ledgers and scribes. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers after Alexander, expanded taxation, issuing bilingual records in Greek and Egyptian. The Romans organized grain shipments on an imperial scale, sending fleets from Alexandria to feed millions in Rome. The Nile's bounty, once sustaining a single kingdom, now sustained empires across the Mediterranean. Reflection, bred as civilization. The monuments of Egypt still rise, but their survival depended on the fragile cycles of bread. Without taxed grain, workers would not have eaten, priests would not have performed rituals, armies would not have marched. The pyramids and temples are silent stone, but behind them lies the hum of grinding querns, the scratching of reed pens, the creak of baskets carried into granaries. Civilization itself was written in loaves and jars. The ordinary farmer, delivering his quota to the scribe, unwittingly supported dynasties that built wonders. And yet, his own life remained precarious, balanced on the flood of the Nile and the ink of the ledger. So you must ask yourself, if ancient Egypt's grandeur rested on something as fragile as the harvest, how stable are the foundations of our own societies? And what might collapse if the ledgers of food and resources were ever left empty?